Welcome to Books of Our Time, brought to you by the Massachusetts School of Law and seen nationwide. Today we shall discuss a book about the women's movement of the 1960s and 1970s, a movement which changed women's lives and the country. The Girl I Left Behind was written by a participant in that movement, Judith Nies, who is with me today. She has worked as a journalist, teacher, historian, researcher, and speechwriter, and is the author of several books. She currently teaches writing at Massachusetts College of Art. And I am Lawrence R. Velvel, the Dean of the Massachusetts School of Law. Judith, thank you for coming up from Cambridge.
My pleasure.
We get a lot of people from Cambridge, but usually they're associated with that school on the Charles.
Right, that other school.
They are putting on the screen right now a copy of your book with this cover, and you say that the girl in that picture, which is of course you, is an artifact of cultural history. Why do you say that? What do you mean by it?
Well, first I want to bring some attention to the subtitle, which is a narrative history of the 1960s. It's both a history and a story of my experience. So that was one thing I wanted to point out. And that a cultural artifact of history was a phrase that I used for when my daughter was then 12 and was paging through a photo album and was asking me a lot of questions about the pictures in the photo album. And she came to that picture and she said something about, you don't look like that anymore. And I realized she was making a comment about more than my makeup, or she was commenting about how sort of frozen that image is with the pearls, the matching sweater set, the perfectly done page boy hair, and that's how we were supposed to look. And this picture was taken in 1965. I was coming into New York on a ship from Europe, and the ship's photographer just said, sit up there and I'll snap your picture. And they sent it to the local paper, the Lynn Item, because I lived in Swampscott, and it was still It was 1965, but culturally for women, it was still part of the 1950s. Right. And women we were just one step away from having to wear white gloves and a hat all the time.
Right, like Jackie Kennedy, a pillbox
The pillbox hats.
Yes. As part of this cultural change, you make the point time and again why the personal is political, and maybe you could explain that in terms of your own life, what you went through, what you saw, what was true for women. Why was the personal political for you and your colleagues in those days?
The specific incident that made it real to me, for a long time it was a slogan, but it became real for me when in 1969, 1970, I was working as a speechwriter for a group of congressmen who were the main opponents to the Vietnam War. And my then husband was working in the Treasury Department for George Shultz. And he came home one night and he said the security people at the Treasury Department kept me in their office all afternoon. And I was quite shocked because he was not highly political. And I said, what had you ever done to have them investigating you? And he said, well, they had an FBI file like this high. And I said, well, why? What had you done? He said, oh, you don't understand. The file was on you, which stopped the conversation. And then the upshot of it was that he had been given 3 pages of questions by the FBI that I was supposed to answer. And for me, here we had the FBI, 2 men from the Treasury Security Office in my kitchen, interrupting my dinner, asking a lot of questions about my politics and what I did for work. And I thought, this is where the political and the personal absolutely intersect.
Now that actually became true for you in many other ways too, because ultimately you became active in the women's movements that were attempting to change the laws and the customs of the country with regard to women. And as you found out that well, let me just leave it at that. And so then the political and the personal truly meshed.
The bulk of the questions were related to a time that I had worked for the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, which is the oldest peace organization in the country. But if I might remind you that at that time, women still had very few rights in the public world. And so that women who were demonstrating in public and actively, in this case they were active in the civil rights movement. Coretta Scott King was a member, and I had worked with her, and they were active against nuclear testing. In the Cold War, you know, that was really considered unpatriotic and dangerous. So it was on that basis, I think, that the FBI judged me to be a security risk. But my question was, who has the right to judge a wife? And where are the requirements of what a wife has to be for a husband to have a security clearance?
I got the sense from reading that it might be very fair to say that when it came to lobbying for, plumping for, being in favor of the movements which have, to some extent, sometimes to a very large extent, succeeded by today, the women who were parts of these organizations, like the one you mentioned, the Women's Strike for Peace, fundamentally were causative factors and disproportionately represented in seeking what I will loosely call, or maybe not so loosely, the good.
I would say they were certainly agents for change, and change in a progressive direction. And as had happened in the past, in order to maintain their standing and their status as having a right to speak out, they had to take on the feminist issues and the right of women to have voice in the public arena.
And not rights, but welfare of children. I mean, there were food. There were a lot of things that were involved that these women took on. But for them, there might never have been changes the way I estimated. You think that's wrong?
Well, are you referring to the earlier, the 1920s women's movement, or the 60s?
I would refer to that too, because, and also the 1960s, and I would refer to the 1920s, and I would also like to ask you a question. I once knew a woman in Washington whose mother had been a medical doctor who graduated from Tufts Medical School in the 1920s, and I knew this woman in the 1980s, and ever since she told me about her mother, I've wondered, what happened to the feminist movement in the 1920s?
Well, the Depression happened, but it didn't really go out of existence. A lot of it kind of just went dormant after the 19th Amendment was passed. And a lot of the women who got into educational institutions as a result of the suffrage and women's movement of the 20s came to the fore in the 1960s. And I'll just mention one, for example, Rachel Carson, who got to go to Johns Hopkins and was trained as a geneticist and I think as a chemist. But she was also a very skillful and talented writer. And she earned her living in the Fish and Wildlife Office of, I think, the Interior Department. But she had learned through a number of people, some of whom were in Massachusetts, about the effects of DDT on bird population. And she did that research and wrote and published Silent Spring, which is considered one of the most influential books of the 20th century. So I would say she was a product of that earlier generation. Betty Friedan she was born a little later. Jane Jacobs, who wrote Life and Death of American Cities, she was also a product of the education that women were finally able to get.
Didn't you say, by the way, that Betty Friedan, not that she copied from Simone De Beauvoir, but that Simone De Beauvoir had said earlier on what Betty Friedan later said. Do I have that right?
Simone De Beauvoir's Second Sex was not widely read in the United States until Betty Friedan's book. And the central thesis of her book is that social, forms are constructed. In other words, all these patterns that we felt were just anchored in concrete about the way women should be, the way marriages should work, that women were supposed to stay in the home. Simone De Beauvoir said, this is ridiculous. These are constructed for social reasons. And that is the theme in Betty Friedan's book, The Feminine Mystique, but she's analyzing American society, and particularly the Freudian psychology that was so influential in the 50s.
We in America often ignore the great thinkers of other societies, and we are 20 and 30 years behind sometimes because of that. And that's not only true in philosophy, it's true in medicine, it's true in a lot of different areas. So I take the position, and I'd like to know what you think about this wild-eyed radical position I take, that the 60s pretty much are the font of much that is good in America. They are portrayed by the right wing and the similar types as being the font of everything that's wrong with America. To those of us who lived through it and know what America was in the 50s and know what America is in the 90s and in the new century, and it was in the 80s, it seems to me the 60s is the font of most or all of this.
You're reminding me that Robert Bork called the 60s a malignant decade.
And you know, I was once good friends with him for a number of years. And that's a malignant statement.
But it was, you know, for democracy to work, there has to be a certain level of fairness. I think a lot of people will agree on that. And it was in the 60s that it became clear that many of our institutions were simply not fair and were not working. And that is true for African Americans in the South. It was true for women in the North, all over the country. It was true for the exclusion of Jews and ethnic groups from a lot of clubs and institutions. A lot of universities had 5% quotas for women and for Jews. So I mean, I could explain a whole lot of structural systems of exclusion.
Yeah. You know, Bork once told me that he was the only person on the entire faculty of Yale University who voted for Barry Goldwater in 1964. And you have to laugh. And I have to say, Bork has got an ounce of prejudice in his body. So whatever else one might think about him, the man is totally unprejudiced. So I totally disagree with his politics, but I wanted that to be on the record. Now, one of the among the many things that you talk about is something that has been taboo to speak about in the United States for, what, 150 years? Actually, according to the book I'm reading now, maybe 180 years. And that is class in the United States. And maybe you could talk about what you think about class, the impact it had on your marriage, the impact it had on you as a young woman who was attempting to break in, so to speak, to the foreign policy field.
Well, I grew up in Swampscott in a working class family. My father worked at the United Shoe in Beverly, the Shoe as it was called. And when I went to graduate school in Washington at the School of Advanced International Studies, which is part of Johns Hopkins, it was the first time anyone had ever asked me, where did you prep? And then after that, someone else would say, now, where do you summer? Now, in Swampscott, summer is not a verb. So I began to become aware that most of my classmates had gone to prep school, had gone to Ivy League colleges. They did summer in very wealthy and well-known locations, and that I was really not educated in elements of class. Class is not a subject that America deals with very successfully because we have the myth of the classless society, and that everyone can go from, you know, the blue-collar family up to becoming a millionaire. And it's a very powerful myth. And you question it at your, with a lot of risk, because until very recently, people will accuse you, well, that's just Marxist drivel if you want to talk about class. But I was happy when I was writing this book, and I felt that class was important to talk about simply because foreign policy is the preserve of the upper class. The New York Times did a long series of front-page articles on class in America.
Right, I remember.
And it was the first time I had seen it covered in some depth. And so I did talk a lot about what's called the hidden injuries of class.
Yeah. That
if you come from a lower working class, you are expected to learn and adapt up. That they are not going to adapt down.
Schools you couldn't get into, scholarships that you couldn't get, summer jobs you had to take that while other people were summering or doing interns with big deal investment banks. I mean, what are some of the specifics? People getting ahead by daddy and mommy making contributions. Throughout the book, you mentioned some of these things. Maybe you can elaborate.
An Ivy League school or a very good prep school, there is a program of internships for the summers to expose you to some of these environments. So you can get a very good internship, let's say in a foundation, at a public television station, in a law firm or whatever. And what I found, especially when I graduated, that for me, it was like I was starting at absolute with no support to look for a job. And as you know, and I'm sure your students know, that when you're out of school and you're looking for your first job, it's a very anxiety-producing time, and some help is really valuable. I think I would have to say at the time I did not know how different my experience was from my classmates. I just knew that all of a sudden they were in some very nice internship or training program or at the World Bank or at the Ford Foundation, and that I didn't even know about.
I graduated from the Michigan Law School in 1963. And I must say that when we were looking for summer jobs for the summer of 1962 and then for permanent jobs, there was a tremendous difference between the jobs that went to the young men, many of them are close friends, who came from WASP backgrounds, and the young men who were Jewish. I mean, there was just no comparison, and this was all part of the same thing, all part of the same thing. How did this, explain if you would, by the way, your husband was CIA, was he not?
Well, I wrote to the CIA and I asked them. They didn't answer.
Ah, okay.
Surprise.
Well.
And I had asked him, and he had nothing to say. So, in that we're in a law school, I don't have.
That's different
right,
from a denial.
I know this.
Yeah.
I know this. In that we're in a law school, I have to say I don't have evidence that would hold up in court. But he certainly has a profile, and the school that we went to sent many people into the CIA.
Right.
So.
Right.
It is not totally far-fetched.
Right. Isn't there a book, by the way, called The Hidden Injuries of Class?
Yes, yes, that's very good. One of the first and the very few.
Okay. Yeah. You see, we have to engage in this pretense, and we have to hold up the occasional person who rises above class, Bill Clinton, as an exemplar, so that everybody else will keep working their fool heads off on the theory that they too can get ahead. When for most people, what you can do is very limited. You have to be one of the enormously talented, enormously lucky few. Somebody once asked, but Napoleon, you know, well, what's the quality he looks for most at his marshals? He said, luck. Okay, explain how class impacted your marriage.
I'm going to just go back to something that you said earlier about the school, how I became, my education in class, I guess I would say. The school used to give dinners for important speakers who came, and I was invited to the one for Dean Acheson, and it was given at the Cosmos Club in Washington, and I had the invitation, I had the dress and the pearls, just like on the cover, good heels, walked up to the door, and the doorman came out, "You can't go in there." I got out my invitation, explained, he said, "Doesn't make any difference. You have to go around back to the ladies' entrance." I had never heard of a ladies' entrance. And the Cosmos Club at the time was the most exclusive and important club for the Washington establishment. And I made it my business to find out who their members were, and it took no women, no Jews, and no African Americans. So it was kind of a bastion of the WASP upper class who had achieved at a certain level in Washington. And I think John Kennedy had to, he was a member, and then he took himself out of the club when it was pointed out that they did not take African Americans when he was running for the presidency. So there were certain expectations of class, and it was a game that you had to learn how to play. So when my husband and I, for example, would go out to a dinner party, at the end of the dinner party, the men would go to the library for brandy, and the women would go to the powder room. This
Right.
was still a ritual of
Right.
Washington,
Right.
and was, I would say, modeled very much on the British upper classes.
Right.
And the British Foreign Service, the British Diplomatic Corps.
What was the impact of this on your marriage, and how did you begin to realize that there was a trip, that what had looked initially like a melding, complementing P-L-E-M-E-N-T,
Yeah.
Actually turned out to be a very bad match?
Well, because I wanted to work, and I wanted to have responsible work, and I wanted to be in the world, and I did not want to be a Washington hostess, and I did not want to sort of be the Washington wife that was expected of that era.
Right.
And he was working in the Treasury Department. He was he was in some international division next to the George Shultz had put in place. And there was very much an expectation of wives, the right wives needed to be Washington hostesses, gracious, didn't talk too much about politics, didn't know too much about politics, certainly was not going to have strong opinions on the Vietnam War or civil rights.
You had a mind and desired to use it, and he had a mind and desired you not to use yours. I mean, that's pretty much it, wasn't it?
Yeah, that was...
it's kind of interesting because the stuff about women providing the social glue, according to some books that have been written recently, this had a tremendous impact as far back as the Jacksonian era. In fact, maybe even the John Quincy Adams era. And, 130 years later, not much, or 140, nothing had changed. How did you come to realize, as you so clearly did, that there is a ruling establishment in Washington, D.C.? What about your experiences or your husband's caused you to come to that realization?
At a certain point, we got the opportunity to live in the carriage house of the old Merriweather Post estate.
Yeah.
She was one of the great Washington hostesses in the 50s, and she was married to Joe Davies, kind of a fixer for Roosevelt. And I, being always a historian, always interested in, kind of the history that was around me, and at that point, that was local history. I discovered that she and Joseph Davies had divorced in the 50s, and very unamicably, I might add, but she had been the loser in this case. And I found it astounding because she had so much money. She was one of the wealthiest women in the country. Yeah. And the way it was explained to me was that he was related by marriage to Millard Tydings, who was one of the great powers in the Senate at that time and head of the Foreign Relations Committee. So he could call on all his Washington friends, and she, even with all her money, she was still just a Washington hostess. Okay. So that was one thing. And then in the neighborhood where we lived, there were a lot of people who never move when an administration changes hands. They're just there permanently.
Right.
And they are in Washington, moving between private industry, back in government, and helping to write the laws and shape the policies.
And still true today.
And it is still true today.
There's always a government in waiting. Now it's the government of Republicans. Until November, it was the Democrats. Absolutely. It used to be in the days of Henry Stimson that the government in waiting was largely in New York in the law firms and in the investment banking houses and in the banks. That has lessened dramatically, and now it's in the permanent government seems to be in Washington.
Well, I think they all take time out to go to Wall Street to make a few millions.
Well,
then they come back.
Some do that in Washington now. Some do that in Washington.
Well, that's true. That's true.
You know, anybody who thinks that Washington is not today's analog to the Versailles of Louis XIV and Louis XVI doesn't know what it's all about. They really do not.
Well, there is a mentality of courtiers. That's
absolutely.
True.
Tell a little bit about how you got involved with foreign policy, and I'm particularly interested in this regard with Ray Rubinoff talking with you, and you were a waitress at Woods Hole, and my suspicion is he knew who you were, and he came down and he recruited you, never letting you even guess that he was a recruiter for the CIA.
To answer those questions, I went back to all the choices I had made in the 60s and how my path had sort of taken me to that point. And that meeting with Ray Rubinoff was extremely important. While I was still in college, somebody had suggested, why don't you apply to this graduate school called SICE? And I did. I had no job. I had no plan.
That was Johns Hopkins.
And it's the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. I had done a very good paper in Russian history on the Soviet secret police, and I think my advisor or my professor said apply. But it was never a realistic possibility in my mind. I did not have the money. Women did not go to graduate school. I didn't see a job coming out of it at the end. And I think, as I mentioned earlier, the only job possibility at Tufts at the time was the telephone company that came looking for.
You didn't have the money, and women didn't go to graduate school. There were no women in medical schools. There were no women in law school. I mean, a handful. No women in business schools. You even talked to a friend of yours at one point about how do we do something? Well, you go to business school. Well, there's no women there.
Right. Harvard Business School didn't take women until '68. Yeah. Harvard Law School did not take women. Period. Yeah. And many of the other schools had 5% quotas for women. Yeah. So you had to be totally dedicated. Yeah. And if you wanted to go to medical school, having had a father who was a doctor who was going to support you. I mean, it was a very tiny percentage.
Right. Anyhow, so you were talking about how you got there and Ray.
Right. So I had filled out this application, had no intention of going, and after college was waitressing at the Landfall, which is still there in Falmouth, Woods Hole. And a man and his wife came in one night and sat at my table. And they were very gregarious New Yorkers and, full of confidence. And they came in, they were on their honeymoon, a second marriage for both of them, and they requested me as their waitress every night. And they always left a big tip. And asked me questions about my future. What was I planning to do, and where did I want to go? What had I majored in? What did you like best in college? Oh, you'd been the editor of the newspaper, and what did you write about, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And at one point he said, but I heard, didn't you tell me you'd been accepted to a graduate school? And I said, yes. And I said, but I don't think I'll go. And asked me what it was. He said, oh, I know that school very well, the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. I went to school in Geneva with the dean. He said, I would be thrilled to write him a letter and say I'd met you and that you will be a terrific addition to the student body. Later, when I'm thinking back about this, I'm thinking, how did he know I'd be a terrific addition to the student body? All I had done is serve them lobsters and Portuguese bread and not spilled it.
You did it with a savoir-faire.
Right. So, in any case, he did send the letter of introduction to the dean, and at the end of the summer, I didn't have a plan. So I thought I saw it sort of as a travel decision as much as a career decision. I'd get to live in Washington, D.C. If it only lasted for a semester, that would be fine. Maybe I could find a job there. I wrote out a check. I made enough tips to pay for the tuition, which in those days I think was $1,200 a year, or $1,500. You couldn't do that now from waitressing tips. And I went. Now fast forward 5 years, and I'm working in Washington. It's 1967, and Ramparts magazine issues a whole series of articles about the CIA, how the CIA had been funding foundations as front organizations for cultural activities.
Right.
And one of the foundations that was a front organization was the Kaplan Fund, for which Ray Rubinow worked. And he had, in fact, kept track of me all through those 5 years, always with a note or a phone call, and he always introduced himself as my godfather.
Right,
He
right,
said,
right,
I don't have children of my own. I like to help young people. This article said that the largest amount of money had gone into encouraging students to go into international studies and be involved in these international student movements. So when I confronted him about this and said, you know, what do you really do? And what does the Kaplan Foundation really do? And why are you taking money from the CIA? And how long has it been going on? He gave me a few lame answers, but then he just vanished from my life.
Right, right.
I never heard from him again.
Right, right, right. Now, once you got to Johns Hopkins, somebody told you that you had to spend a half a year or a year in Bologna. And maybe you could explain why Bologna, why they told you that, and what you did touring the Middle East before you actually started at Bologna.
I had majored in European studies and taken French, and they had a second-year school at the University of Bologna in Italy, which was, and I think still is, a communist city. It's a very interesting situation. And my advisor, who spent about 10 minutes with me, said, well, European studies, you've got to go to Italy, go to Bologna. And I said, but I'm learning French. Shouldn't I go to a school in France? No, 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 we don't have a school in France. Our school is in Bologna. And I said, well, it seems to me that it would cost a lot of money. And Europe was really very far away in those days. It was not the way people virtually commute today.
Air travel and telephones were a world apart.
Right. No cell phones, no credit cards, flying very expensive, mainly just business classes flew. So I took a walk outside and was on the embassy side of Massachusetts Avenue, and Secret Service people stopped me and said, stop right there, you can't go any further. And I looked around, the street's practically empty. There's a couple of pedestrians on the other side. But I couldn't understand what they were stopping me for. And just then, this huge limousine pulls up, 2 American flags and the presidential flag flying, and out steps John F. Kennedy. And we're like 10 feet apart. I mean, it was, and I'm the only person there. He's expecting a welcoming committee. And I wave and say, hello, Mr. President. And he gives his movie star smile, and on he goes into the embassy. And I am then thinking, we all had those, you know, his wonderful speeches in our head. Ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. Let's get America moving again. The new frontier of which I speak is a set of challenges, and so on and so forth. So, you know, I had those tapes in my head, and I said, well...
No, and it's all a crock in retrospect, but anyway.
Yeah, but I had that, all right, well, I should take this risk. I should go to Italy, even though I barely know where their school is, and I'm going to have to take out loans to do it. So I go back, go to the registrar, make out the application, and I had to take an oral exam in French, and growing up in a blue-collar family in Swampscott, this was a hard thing to do, although my grandmother's family was French-Canadian, but nobody spoke French. And so I got a job at a camp in France it was a French-American bilingual camp, but the main language was French. And I thought this would help me with my French before I had to go learn Italian, which was very confusing. And after about 3 weeks, I was fired from that camp, along with 5 or 6 other people, and ended up in Geneva.
You and other people got fired because the person who was in charge of the camp that summer was a raving imbecile.
Thank you. Yes, this is true. Even the director, the owner of the camp, told me that later. And he sold the camp not long after that. But so I'm in Geneva without any money, and a very temporary place to live. And I answer an ad on a church bulletin board for a woman who is an anthropologist and who needs a researcher and a typist for the summer. I get the job. It's room and board, no money, but she's very interesting, and she is writing her dissertation for the University of North Carolina. Her husband works at the World Health Organization, and in the middle of our organizing her papers and my typing the dissertation, she says, I have to go to Turkey, unexpectedly. I have a professor I have to interview, and he's going to be leaving. I had planned to go in the fall, but he's leaving for Mesopotamia, which was Iraq. She did speak in the terms of the old Ottoman Empire.
George Bush didn't say we're going to fight in Mesopotamia.
Right. And so I found myself on the Orient Express, which was the train, you know, the fabled train that went from London all the way to Istanbul. And then we traveled by bus and whatever local transportation we could find along the coast of Turkey as she traced this ancient firewalk. And I did all the arrangements and got a Turkish phrase book. And this was before there was really an official tourist industry. So I was really off the American bus, is the way I would describe it. I am really having to encounter and interact with people in these tiny villages. And when we got to Ankara, and she was still planning to go further east, I had a telegram saying that I would not be admitted to the school in Bologna unless I got back there by, I think it was September 25th or something like that. And we'd been traveling for 6 weeks, I think. So by myself, I got on a bus in Ankara at 6 in the morning and traveled through the dead center of Turkey, through the Anatolian plain, and through these tiny villages. And in school, in our studies of foreign policy, we had been told that Ataturk had modernized Turkey, and that the women no longer wore those traditional black veils, and it was a secular country. They were no longer practicing the Muslim religion, et cetera, et cetera. And this was true to a certain degree in the cities, in Ankara and Istanbul. But in the rural areas, it was still an agricultural country. The old patterns were there. And I saw these women head to toe in black, and some of them got on the bus. And I was wearing a sleeveless blouse and a skirt and sandals. It was about 110 degrees. And these women turned around and stared at me with murder in their eyes because it was so offensive to them to see a woman with bare flesh. It was just, I can't quite think of what an equivalent would be, but it was just outrageous. So even though it was so hot, I did have a sweater in my bag, and I put it over my shoulders and covered my arms. They got off the bus at a certain point. And then, but all the way along, I would see they were separating wheat and chaff by the mean of wooden pitchforks. It was really 1,000-year-old agricultural methods. So by the time I got to Bologna and got into my actual classes, I realized that countries were much more than per capita income and gross national product and the economic terms that we use to describe a country. That
in the school.
In the school,
yeah.
In the official way that we were being taught. And that at the time when Vietnam was just heating up, and they talked about, well, we're just going into Vietnam, we're going to win the hearts and minds of the peasants. And they saw no way that this country of 20 million peasants, an agricultural country, which Vietnam was, with 20 million people. There would be no way they could fight back against the American military machine.
There's an old saying, 1,000 beautiful theories ruined by one ugly fact. And, you know, we've had 1,000 beautiful foreign policy theories, take no account of the ugly facts that confute them.
Well, Iraq is a perfect example. Yeah. That they have a whole theory of how it was going to go with this constitution, and they set up an investment system and taxes, and then it would just touch the reality of Iraq. And
there's a tragic and fascinating episode that you talk about, that's something that happened to you. And that's when you sort of, your inner psyche, if I may call it that, upchucked at what was going to happen to you if you performed well on a test you had to take, and therefore it caused you to perform horribly lest you succeed. You know, you really ought to talk about that. That's not terribly different, by the way, than the theory of Shelby Steele, or is it his brother? I think it's Shelby Steele's, Claude Steele, that African-American people have done worse on tests because they're told all their lives that they can't do well on the test, so the test comes and, you know, no good. Anyhow, something like this happened to you, so maybe you can describe what happened on that, or on those oral exams.
I had passed all my courses, but you have to, in order to graduate, you had to take 2 oral exams, one in language, which I had to take in French, and the other one was a general exam in 4 subjects: economics, diplomatic history, international law, and you know, there were 6 people lined up on one side of the table, and you're supposed to answer all these questions. By the end of the year, I realized that I thought, and my questions were very different from my classmates, and that I felt, although I could never have expressed it this way, that we were being indoctrinated rather than educated. And the idea of critical thinking was really not part of the curriculum. And I was torn because I'd spent 2 years and invested a fair amount of money in getting this degree, but I felt if I passed, I would be setting off on a road that I shouldn't be on.
You would be a functionary for the military-industrial state.
And that it was not who I was, and I was not going to succeed at it. And I later encountered Howard Thurman's, he's a theologian and a philosopher, who said, in terms of thinking about your resume, ask not what the country needs, ask what makes you come alive, because what the country needs is people who are alive. I'm paraphrasing here slightly. Yeah. So I think that my collapse of will was a good thing. What happened in effect was I entered the room, but my mind stayed outside. Right. So in all the questions they asked me, I just said, you know, I just don't know. I don't remember that. So they had to fail me. There was no letting me slip through. I didn't give them anything that they could work with.
And your professor knew that something wrong had happened because he knew how much you knew. And of course you passed it later. But it's kind of interesting that, you know, you suddenly upchucked at the thought of proceeding on this trail for which you had been programmed, because, you know, you really knew this isn't me and I don't want to do this. Yeah. When you came back to, tell us about Nigel. You must tell us about Nigel.
You like this character in this book. When I finished, after failing my exams, I went to Greece for the summer, and I worked in a little tourist shop, and it was, the island was Hydra. Now, I think, I haven't been there in years and years, and people tell me it would be an unhappy experience for me to go back. But then it was completely unspoiled, and there was a very small artist colony, mainly British and Scandinavian. And they were writers or artists of some kind. And because I spoke English, they would invite me to their parties. And Nigel was a former British journalist who was there working on a novel. Kind of a Graham Greene type character. And he liked to talk to me about politics because I was the only American on the island, and he would give me his old New York Times. And I used to call his monologues, I'd call them the Nigel seminars, because he was telling me about all the things the CIA had done that we Americans knew nothing about. And in fact, in Europe, the CIA was the face of America in some ways. So he'd been in Iran when Mossadegh had been overthrown. And so he was telling me the story about how the CIA engineered that. James Roosevelt and that silly Shah got put back on the throne. And then he said, and then they went to Guatemala, and they overthrew the government in Guatemala. And then they were in the Congo. And I thought these stories were, he was making this all up. And I listened, but I just, sure. But 2 years ago, Timothy Weiner wrote a book called The Legacy of Ashes, The History of the CIA, and he researched what I call the Nigel seminars. It's the same, sequence of events, and in fact, it was all true.
Well, yes, and it's been known for a while. I must say, Weiner's book I stopped reading because he has an unparalleled collection of mistakes. The CIA did nothing right. It's just unbelievable. Okay. Anyway, you came back, and once in the United States again, you went to work for a group of congressmen. Maybe you can tell us how that happened and the kind of experience you had, and that you apparently wrote an article about that caused a lot of hair to stand on end.
Well, first I went to work for the Women's Peace Organization.
Yes.
That was the first job, because again, at the time, women's jobs were advertised in separate pages in the newspaper,
right.
And I could get no help from the school. The guidance counselor said, "Oh, I've got a perfect job for you. A good writer, knows French." And then he just said, "Oops, I need to send a man." And other people I interviewed, a man said, without slightest self-consciousness, "Oh," he said, "I'd love to hire you, but my boss hates women in the workplace. Or I can meet you for an interview, but it will have to be at the bar at the Mayflower at 6 o'clock, et cetera, et cetera." So I went to work for the Women's Peace Organization for 2 years, and that was when I worked with Coretta Scott King and was fairly active in the civil rights movement, and learned about the growing feminist movement, which had gotten not much publicity yet. And then in '68, I went to work for the group of 10 congressmen who were the key opponents to the Vietnam War, and were organized and vocal about it. And to give a translation of it, you would have to think if there were 10 Republican congressmen during the run-up to the Iraq War, if they had organized and held public hearings opposing it,
right.
and bringing in experts to explain how disastrous the planning was and the policies. So it was quite a radical group at the time.
People our age will recognize names like Don Fraser, Don Edwards, Ben Rosenthal, Bob Eckhart. I think.
Yep.
And your experience with this group, despite their putative liberalism, was astonishing.
Well, they were symptomatic of the culture as a whole. Only one of them, I think, had a wife who worked. They were from 10 to 20 years older than I was, and they had come up in politics at a time when politics was a man's game. Women were largely volunteers, raised money, addressed envelopes, sent out appeals. And in Congress itself, although there were thousands of women working on Capitol Hill, for the most part they were all secretaries or receptionists. So they didn't have any experience in working with women as peers. I think, they'd gone to law school, it had all been men. So a professional environment for them was an all-male environment.
Yeah.
And so the first problem was that they paid me close to between a half and 2/3 of what they paid the man who had had the job before me.
Which was typical everywhere.
Which unfortunately was typical everywhere. And then my paycheck would get held up, wouldn't get deposited in the account. And I rotated the payrolls of the different congressmen. And when I objected to this, they said, well, isn't your husband working? Has your husband stopped working? I said, I write my own checks. I don't like to have my own checks bouncing. Well, we'll get it cleared up. But it kept happening, and it kept happening. And as Ben Rosenthal said when we finally got together about this, he said, well, paying a woman is just not the same as important as paying a man.
Yeah. And at meetings, I know, and I've known female lawyers who have expressed this, people in their 50s now, you know, treated badly, called a crazy lady, objections if you dared to make a comment about something. This was really quite a different world that you were pioneering, really, in which you were pioneering.
Well, and they were, I mean, I have to say I learned a lot. I mean, about negotiating and how power works, but they were as liberal as the political system allowed, and they did not have a clue about women's rights.
Right. So, you know, over the course of those times in the two women's organizations you worked for, the other one being the Women's Strike for Peace, you met and became you met women who went back to the 1920s, and you learned about the women who had been pioneers in feminism and other things in the late 1800s. And you made a comment which would resonate with Napoleon Bonaparte, who said, I think it was Napoleon who said, history is agreed upon lies.
Well, the other way of putting it is it's written by the winners.
Not always. The Confederates after the Civil War wrote the history, but largely so.
Yeah, this is...
Largely so. And you comment, I'd like you to elaborate your comment, that there are blackouts in history.
Huge silences in history. And and the women's movement is one of them. I have kept my old college history book, and the line in it that deals with the entire women's movement is that women were given, put that in quotes, the vote after their work in World War I. Totally passive voice. And in fact, the women's movement had a 70-year history before women, quote, were given the vote. And there had been over 400 state referenda trying to get women's vote on the ballot. And they had raised millions of dollars in nickels and pennies, and there had been 3 or 4 different women's organizations. So I was curious about why it was considered so insignificant. And my theory about this, and this is part of why I wrote this book as well, because women today don't know this very recent history of the women's movement in the 60s and how much changed in a very short time. But I think it is that there is kind of a master narrative for American history, and the really hard lessons of change don't get put in.
You know, what you're talking about is part and parcel of the reaction in historical research and writing that started around 1960 to the great man and the white wasp.
Right.
I'll go ahead and elaborate that if you want.
No, I think you do it
when
better.
They started looking at the lives of the ordinary people, the laborers, the women, the African Americans, you know, and started writing history, as it were, from the bottom up instead of from the top down. Right. To which a lot of people have responded, well, yeah, but you're forgetting who the great people were and the politicians and this and that. But fundamentally, it's kind of like the same thing. And since we know no history, Americans know no history, people think that everything was just invented yesterday, when some of this stuff goes back 150, 200 years.
One example is, for years, Harvard had no labor history course in their history department. So
astounding.
You don't learn about unions, organizing, you don't learn about child labor, you don't learn about women in the labor force. You don't learn about how, when the laws were proposed to combat child labor, they were accused of being communists.
Right, and all this stuff goes back to 1820, 1830.
Well, industrialization.
And that's when a lot of the the workers' movement started too. Tell us a little bit about Paul Nitz's farm and Zumwalt, and you know, what all of that meant in terms of selection of who gets ahead in American society.
Paul Nitze was one of the founders of SICE, a very important man in American government. He just died 2 years ago. He was in and out of every high position in the State Department and in
you know, can I interject? He's responsible for national
NSC 68.
Thank you, which Andrew Bacevich thinks is one of the most, I think I'm fairly he was here. I think it's fair to say he thinks this is one of the most evil documents in American history. It had among the worst long-term, short and long-term effect of any document in American history.
That's a whole subject in itself. But in any case, he is a very important man in Washington. Never got to be a secretary, which he wanted, but he made up for that by mentoring hundreds of people and slotting them into different places in the bureaucracy. And one of the ways that these people came to cohere was through social events, which are very important in Washington life. And he had a farm, has a farm. His family has a farm up in Port Tobacco, Maryland, and there'd be very lovely tennis weekends. And my husband and I went one weekend as a guest, and I ended up watching the tennis and striking up a conversation with a young man who was sitting there, and whose name was Elmo Zumwalt, and his father was Admiral Zumwalt, who was Chief of Naval Operations. And he was very enthusiastic. He was going off to Vietnam in 3 days. And I had a very bad sense of what was going to happen to him. And we had a very civilized conversation, but he did not understand how I could work for these congressmen who were opposing the war, who opposed military appropriations. I mean, he was part of the heart of the naval establishment. So he went off to war, and he comes back 3 years later, and he's very ill, and immune disorder and chronic fatigue, and we had just begun hearing about Agent Orange, and it's called Agent Orange because it was shipped in these orange barrels. And the Defense Department and the Veterans Administration, these symptoms have nothing to do with Agent Orange, but tens of thousands of veterans were having leukemia, cancers, and they'd all been exposed to this. It was a defoliant. Yeah. And in Congress, we knew about it because we had gotten reports about Vietnamese women who lived in those areas where the defoliant had been sprayed, and they were having babies who were terribly deformed. So we knew there was a connection between the Agent Orange and its human effects. But for years, nothing. The Veterans Administration, the administration would take no responsibility whatsoever for it. Finally, young Elmo Zumwalt died, and his father pressured George H.W. Bush to put him on the commission that was investigating Agent Orange. And he threw out the American studies that had been, or if he didn't throw them out, he just put them aside. And he got the Swedish studies of Agent Orange. Its main ingredient was dioxin, which is considered only second to radioactive waste in toxicity. And he published the memo that the Office of Management and Budget had sent out to all the services, saying that they could not acknowledge Agent Orange's effects because A, the cost to the government of taking care of all these sick veterans, and B, the liability that the corporations, the chemical corporations, would be held to.
Is it any wonder that people don't trust the United States government? We have to wrap this up. I want to thank you very much.
My
you know,
pleasure.
I really enjoyed the book among many reasons, because I lived through this and because I think that you're spot on, as the British say, in what you were saying.
Thank you.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you. To the audience, thank you for being here. Be with us again next time.
Bye.